Okay, my apologies for all of that, various technological difficulties this morning. Couple of things to say before we get going in what promises to be a beautiful new week. The first is to let you know the result of the latest poll, which was, if you remember, whether you wanted to have someone from CalPERG come and do a presentation about the immense range of opportunities and great campaigns they can do, or to listen to more of me, which after last week I'm amazed that anyone would want to do. And the stunning result of that poll is that 75% of you want more of me. So I shall inform CalPERG that they can't compete. The second thing I wanted to say is that music requests are coming through and they're great. And this morning I was faced with this most hideous of dilemmas because Catherine Hood, where's Catherine? Catherine suggested, and this was absolutely right, and so even though what I'm about to say is going to sound nasty, it's meant in the nicest possible way, suggested Sinead O'Connor's Famine Song, which actually I didn't know, and I listened to, and I thought it was so grotesque that I couldn't bring myself to play it. And I do suggest to all of you should just listen to it on iTunes, just a little snippet that they allow you to hear. Someone else also suggested that I play Paddy Riley's Fields of Fernie, which is sounds like a traditional Irish song, but it actually was written in 1972 and has become most famous because Glasgow Rangers now use a version of that song when they're playing Celtic. So if you know, there are two soccer teams in Glasgow, Rangers, which is the Protestant team, Celtic, which is the Catholic team. And so the Protestant Rangers fans sing this famine song, which basically says the famine's over, it's time for you lot to go home now, to the Celtic Catholic supporters. But the various versions of that I could find on YouTube were so objectionable that I thought I couldn't play that in a public place. So anyway, keep the request coming on. This one was actually Anthony Lee. Where's Anthony? Suggested that I play Shadow Play at Joy Division. Just happens to be my favourite all-time band, so it was an easy pick. Okay, enough of the frivolities. Now let's get on, and I'm going to be very mindful of time today, and I'm going to be expecting you to ask me some questions as we go through. So last week, you'll remember, if you haven't erased it from your memory because of the immense horror of the experience, I gave you this long and rather abstract guide to the processes that have been transforming Britain for a century or more before 1848. And I also gave you, and this was the sort of very abstract bit, a guide to, a sort of beginner's guide to the sort of theories and ideas of liberalism, in order to be able to grasp how it was that contemporaries came to understand those changes. And I suggested to you on Thursday, at the point when you were all falling asleep, that liberalism had basically become the common sense of the age by 1848. Now this week, what I'm going to do is to give you some very concrete historical examples of events that illustrate how that liberal vision of the world operated in practice. And I'm going to do it today by contrasting two events. The Great Famine in Ireland from 1846 and the Great Exhibition, the world's first great trade fair in London in 1851. And then on Thursday I'm going to compare two other events, the revolt of the Chartists in 1848 and the revolt in India in 1857. Now the point of these lectures for both today and on Thursday is to demonstrate what the sort of governing principles of liberal political economy and political theory and practice were in the middle of the 19th century. And you're going to see that they basically both depend upon creating certain winners and certain losers, who should be rich, who should be poor in the context of today's lecture, who should be a citizen and who should remain a subject in the case of Thursday's lecture. And I'm going to be suggesting to you that the only way that you can really understand how it is that one becomes what I described last week as this ideal liberal person is by thinking about the range of people that they were not. That is to say that people became these ideal new types of persons by understanding themselves in opposition to those people who fell short of those high standards. And I'm going to basically suggest to you both today and Thursday that you can't understand this liberal vision of the world without understanding all the other people that it considers not worthy of its own exemplary freedoms. One other point that I want to make as a preliminary remark today, which is to say I mentioned briefly on Thursday that I didn't want you to think that even though liberalism had become the common sense of the age, that it was not contested, that there weren't people arguing and reacting and responding and revolting against it. And you're going to see that both today and in Thursday, that there are going to be two different types of responses. One is a conservative reaction against it, which looks very much like a defense of tradition and defense of a sort of customary way of organizing society. And the other is a radical project to, if you like, extend and radicalize the liberal project, to make it more democratic or more socially responsive. So today, I'm going to, as I said, return to these two enormously important framing events of the late 40s and early 1850s, the famine in Ireland and the Great Exhibition. And I'm using them, again, to remind you, to illustrate the lessons of liberal political economy, how it was that the economy was thought should work, and how this moment represents at the time of its effective triumph. Okay? And you're going to see that this is the moment in which people are celebrating and imposing the principles of a liberal political economy that seem as though they're beyond question and beyond doubt. So this first section of the lecture is called The Gospel of Free Trade. Now, I said on Thursday, very briefly, when I was outlining Adam Smith's economic theories, that his dependence upon the idea of the invisible hand as the distributive mechanism of the market continued to owe much to a type of providential thought, the idea that God was somehow behind at the operation of the market. And I'm going to suggest to you today that, again, what we think of as a totally disinterested scientific approach to thinking about the way in which markets work best when they're left in their free and supposedly natural state owes much more to religion and to moral conceptions than to anything that we would hold today to be scientific. And I'm going to suggest that, in a sense, that liberal political economy becomes a type of secular religion in mid-19th century Britain. And whereas Smith was preoccupied with how wealth was generated and how it was that people's desire for wealth helped propel them on to industry in order to achieve it. Thomas Malthus, who I had to skip over on Thursday, went to what we might say the dark side, represented, if you like, the dark side of liberal political economy. He was like the Darth Vaders of liberal political economy, because he was interested primarily with how it is that you explain poverty, not wealth. And his argument was that basically poverty was rooted in man's sinful nature and lack of moral discipline. And it was that lack of moral discipline that led people to reproduce too quickly without the resources to support their families. And that led to the classic Malthusian trap that population growth would always outstrip the ability to provide, to sustain that population with food supply. And it would also, of course, create a glut in the labour market that would drive wages down. And as you know, his great idea was that every now and again some natural or divinely ordained event would happen that would provide a check to that population growth. And that was famines, floods, wars, etc., etc. Here again, you have, and this isn't at all a surprise given that Thomas Malthus was also a reverend, a priest in the Anglican Church, that he believed that these events were providential, that they were the work of God. Now, this view of the world, this close connection between thinking about how economies work and thinking about how morality and religion works, was very much part of what historians call the evangelical revival in the late 18th and early 19th century. And this evangelical revival comes as a reaction against the rather, how do I put this, rather staid nature of the Anglican Church, of the established Anglican Church, an attempt to, if you like, evangelize and to radicalize the Christian mission of the Anglican Church. And this evangelical revival held very close to these ideas. Basically, that what you have happening in the 19th century is a view that economic salvation, economic prosperity, comes from one's moral character. Okay? So therefore, if you either go bankrupt or if you go poor, it's a sign of one's own moral failure. Okay? And that's very important, that bankruptcy and poverty is a consequence of an individual's inability to live up to the moral standards required to succeed in the marketplace. Now, free trade was at the center of this a moralized vision of the economic world. And it emerges in these very particular conditions and in this very specific place of late 18th, early 19th century Britain. What this view of free trade does is effectively say, look, the market has to be left in its natural free conditions. Trade has to be restored to those free conditions. And as Smith argued, all the obstacles to that freedom of trade had to be removed. That the state had to actively intervene into the marketplace to remove the obstacles to free trade. And because the market works best when it's left in its free and natural condition, the way in which society is ordered, the way in which wealth is distributed, then becomes legitimated. That is to say that this view of the free market creates an understanding that however wealth is distributed, however society is as a consequence organized, is a natural, proper condition.